What's up, everybody? Post Edit Dario here live. Not live, but I'm here. So this is the full interview with Howard in our latest episode. As promised, it's got a lot of great detail in it. It was just so long, we didn't want to kind of overwhelm you with the original release. So we decided, Sarah and I, to release this as audio as well as a full-length video, just to give Howard his just due and so you can hear the whole dope conversation. Now, if you listen to the 10-minute part in the episode, you can go ahead and jump ahead to the 10-minute mark, 10-second mark, and that's where the new stuff you haven't heard begins. But if you haven't heard it, you go ahead and listen from the jump. The whole 36 and almost 37-minute video. Go ahead, check it out. Here's the full interview with Howard, 77 Flavors of Chicago. Let's go.
Well, I'm at DePaul University, and I direct this center, the Stain Center, which is a community engagement center for the institution, for the university. But I also teach and do research with students, mainly on food in Chicago and a couple of other places as well, and increasingly beyond Chicago. I've also done a lot of archival and historical research on Chicago and its food system. So I'm happy to tell you whatever you would like to hear about.
All right. We want to know everything.
To the degree to which I know,
Okay.
because I didn't do it alone. And it's also with my co-author Daniel Block at Chicago State University.
So let's talk about the chapter you just mentioned. You were talking about a chapter that talks about the effect of
Industry and immigrants and
Sure. Well, in thinking about Chicago and food, it goes back to the very beginning of the city itself, and even pre-Chicago. So the book that we put together, Daniel Block and I, begins really with an understanding of Chicago as a food city, but kind of quickly moves into sort of the indigenous groups that inhabited this space until 1833, and the kinds of foods that they produced and distributed and consumed, and really the indigenous practices lie at the foundation of Chicago as a food city, really. Especially grains. But also some things that perhaps we've lost touch with, in addition to our many prairies that became grain-producing farms and are still today. Mostly today corn and soy.
Right.
But
I was going to say my most miserable years were spent in cornfields, surrounded by cornfields. So yes.
Fair enough.
college is what she's talking about.
I went to Illinois State, so it was just I want to say it's corn,
It is.
right?
Corn and soy.
Corn and soy, just everywhere.
So that's, getting into the central Illinois and the Illinois Valley, some of the most fertile land in the country. Essentially, those prairies became farms with white settlers in the mid 19th century.
Right. Is the soil, the fertility comes from the fact that it was like swampy? Is that?
So I'm not going to be able to give you a lot on the geology and ecology of those prairies, but I will tell you, because that's not my area of expertise, but I will tell you that the Illinois has one of the best watersheds because of the Great Lakes and because of the aftermath of the sort of ice age, and which is essentially the Great Lakes.
Right.
10,000 some years ago and the melting of the glaciers. And so we have a real treasure here, right? 20% of the world's fresh water.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Wait, the Great Lakes is 20% of the world's freshwater?
Yes.
Yeah, you didn't know that?
Man, look, I did not pay attention like I should have. Wait, what?
Yeah.
That's why it's called the Great Lakes.
I mean,
Oh,
they're
okay.
huge. I feel like that's why when people talk about how, oh, sure, you have beaches in Chicago, they don't understand that Lake Michigan is like a lot. Just because it's a lake doesn't mean it's small. It just means it's freshwater.
Right. That's
Very large.
Man, I really should have paid attention a lot more. Like learning now as an adult is way more fun than
Yeah,
as a
right,
kid.
because you're actually interested in
I'm,
the things you're
I'm
learning
very
about.
interested in
Yeah.
this. We got to talk about this later, but yeah, no, keep on going. That's interesting.
So the indigenous populations that lived here over thousands of years, right, since the glacier receded and people came down from the north and started settling here. Now, Chicago was not a very friendly place to settle in. I mean, let's think about it for a second. Summers, let's just start with that.
Right.
Swampy
Yeah.
place, hot, steamy, mosquitoes,
Horrible.
the whole thing, right? And then winter, right?
Right. Just very harsh.
Just harsh with the lake effect,
Yeah.
weather that we get here. So people aren't really settling in mass
Right.
along the southern tip of Lake Michigan.
Right.
But they are when it comes especially to when they get pushed around because of various conflicts, especially when the Europeans start to conflict with each other over fur trade and all their,
Right.
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 other sort of
Yeah.
Right.
issues of power. So there's actually some of the groups that were here when Europeans arrived were refugees. Some of the first people who lived, well, some of the people who lived here when the Europeans arrived. The first people who lived here were prehistoric.
Right.
Right. Right.
There's a lot of, information in the book on that as well. But the people who lived here, they knew how to produce and store food over winter in pits. They dug pits, whether it was legumes or seeds or other kinds of, and eventually corn.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
So corn comes up from Central America
Right.
to Illinois, first around the beginning, first century, 70 AD, around that time.
Wow.
Wow.
To Illinois, and eventually comes north.
Right.
But there are other products that the indigenous population was creating. There's a whole span of different foods. Perhaps one of the most interesting ones that I was going to say we've lost touch with is from our forests that we also had intermixed here in deciduous trees that produce nuts.
Right.
So there was a whole nut industry, perhaps one of the biggest industries across northern Illinois,
Really?
not so much along the coast, Lake Michigan, but and to some degree, yes, but especially up as you go farther north in current Illinois and southern Wisconsin.
Wow. That's
They're all the major, not only just acorns and from oak, but hazelnuts and other types of nuts.
Yeah.
wow. So I'm glad you said that because I was going to ask what isn't as prevalent now as it was. You know what I mean? And I had no clue. I think that's the first time we've heard nuts.
Like a nut
being-
industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the indigenous populations across mainly northern and central Illinois, southern Wisconsin, currently,
Yeah.
today what we would call that, they didn't exist as states
Yeah,
during
right.
that time, but there was whole nut production industries.
Wow.
They actually had a type of nut meat that is spoken about in the archaeological literature. I'm sure they didn't call it meat,
Right.
but it was a type of protein that was stored and packed for distribution, and especially during the winter months,
Wow.
it's really important.
OG vegan food. Yeah.
Yeah.
OG vegan food. Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
I might think about it that way. It became very clear that removing the prairies and cultivating grains was going to be lucrative. And so, let's see, I think one of the things I was going to mention was that, just a fact, just kind of give you a sense, just in the 1830s, in 1838, the first shipment of grains, of wheat, went out of Chicago, and it was 3,670 bushels out of the port of Chicago, right?
Wow.
And the next year, it went from 3,670 to 628,000
So double.
bushels.
What do you mean double?
No, more.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and so
100, almost a million.
so by mid-century, it was 2 million.
Jesus.
Wow.
And so Chicago was well on its way to becoming this place for centralizing grains from across the prairies in the Midwest, especially to the
That's
west,
crazy.
across Illinois, across Iowa,
Yeah.
and so forth. And so one of the key figures in that process was the first mayor of Chicago, William Ogden.
Yep.
And Ogden, he was not only mayor, but in a typical Chicago way, he was an investor.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. We talked about that. Yeah.
And so one of the interesting things about Ogden is he had, bought onto this vision of connecting the Des Plaines River to Chicago River, and in order to bring cargo, principally grains,
Right.
from the prairies to the port.
Right. Right.
Before that, it was horse and carriage.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Right. And so, I mean, how much harder can it get, right? And
Yeah.
so he went on a recruitment process to recruit immigrants to build a canal. And in the 1840s and around mid-century in general, there was one key place that had a lot of immigrants. It was Ireland,
Oh, wow.
because of the potato famine.
Right.
We can get into the whole history of the potato
Yeah.
famine, and that potatoes actually are from South America and like somehow become an Irish staple.
Right.
But in any case, the potato famine, etc., the economic crisis in Ireland leaves all of these potential workers to be recruited to Chicago. And Ogden recruits them to Chicago, and they settle in a place called Canalport, which today is Bridgeport.
Bridgeport.
Right, yeah.
Right by the stockyard.
Yep.
Yep.
And they begin to be part of the workforce that builds the first canal. There's two canals.
Yeah.
The first canal, it essentially goes the route of Marquette and connects the Des Plaines and Chicago River, and vastly expands the capacity, right, to get into the millions and millions of bushels of grain, and then results in Chicago itself, especially what we see as downtown along the river, becoming this grain elevator capital, essentially where grains came in from the former prairies, from the countryside, and were weighed, and there's a whole system put in place to get them ready for export.
Wow. This is so interesting how it really, that river was so key and
So
vital.
River
I mean,
Central.
between the grains and the stockyards,
Yeah. Right.
like there's no denying that Chicago.
Well,
was
yeah, and a
major.
lot of it comes out of both grains and meat. A lot
Yeah.
of Chicago's food history, food
Right.
center. A lot of Chicago as a center of food innovation and industrial development is built on grains and meat, of course.
Right.
And so there were two key pieces of that, though, that made it possible. Not only our location and the sort of environment and the ecology of the space, but as people became aware of this potential lucrative sort of
This gold mine
economy
place. Yeah.
Yeah.
around grains especially,
Right.
it brought all these folks, innovators, to come to Chicago to build ways to create more. And this is like still very Chicago.
Right.
Yeah, I was about to say that's
Build
still
more possibilities for expanding the industry of grains. And probably the first most important one would be John Deere.
Yeah, we talked about that. Heckwish in the area.
Well, yes, but John Deere settled in southwest of Rockford.
Oh,
Okay.
awesome.
And created the first plow, essentially, that would
That's crazy. I
you know,
didn't even know.
that was made out of steel. Okay,
Right. Yeah.
and that steel plow would be sort of really critical in tilling the soils that were so difficult to till
Right.
in central and northern Illinois. So it made it much easier for farmers and settlers to come in and produce those grains. And then the second one would be McCormick, Cyrus McCormick, who, you know, every grade schooler learns, invented the mechanical reaper, right?
Right.
Which vastly expanded the harvest potential from those farms.
Wow.
And that plant was set up at the mouth of the Chicago River, basically where DuSable had
Right.
his house.
Right there.
Yeah, and huge, you know, plant there that would produce these reapers that would, you know, farmers would be coming into Chicago and buy these reapers, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, it was a marketplace for this agricultural tools. Eventually that becomes the sort of origins of the combine, right?
Okay.
Which becomes the most important thing to up till today in harvesting grains.
Wow.
Chicago.
Yeah. So, you know, his plant eventually went to the southwest side on Western and Blue Island, 40 acres.
Yeah.
There were 40 acres of McCormick, you know, production there around the reaper and other kinds of tools. So, but, you know, getting back to the water and the river,
Yeah.
you know, pretty early on, even Ogden knew that that wasn't going to be enough. I mean, the original canal was like, you know, not that much bigger than the length of this table, and essentially, they knew that trains would be the way to bring in grains, and so there was a train proposal that the city council actually rejected to bring a train in from like Galena area up into the city. Eventually, you know, Ogden and the train industry that was going to emerge won out because of grains. Chicago became like a transportation hub
Right.
for initially cargo, but eventually people, right?
Yeah.
From across the country.
Wow.
And so you have grains really being one of the reasons why Chicago is like this transportation.
Transportation.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
That was like the test.
well, it was like the impetus.
Yeah. Right.
I think what, just one of the side notes about this interesting sort of cultural things that emerge out of the grain industry is, you know, you have all these silos along the Chicago River
Right.
with all these elevators. And one of the biggest, in fact, it was the biggest when they built it, was built by Sturgis and the Buckingham brothers. And so John Buckingham, I think, had a son named Clarence, who's the namesake of Buckingham Fountain.
Wow.
So, you know, and that you would be able, standing at Buckingham Fountain today, you would be able to see that grain elevator. It was so
Wow.
massive
Wow.
along the Chicago River.
What building is there now?
Condos.
Yeah, everything. I want to know what's the, you know, like.
I don't know. You'd have to do a little
Beating it.
geographic research to get that.
That's wild.
The other thing that is really important about the grains is by the beginning of the 20th century, it was well understood that there were a lot of products that could come out of the grains, principally corn.
Right.
The wheat industry, even though Chicago remained important, really moved to Minnesota. So corn became king in Chicago. And there were a number of people who came together to invest in something that would today we take for granted. It was sort of wet milling of corn, where they would transform it into starches and oils. So you have Argo cornstarch in Summit, Illinois, right outside the city, not too far from the largest water reclamation plant in the world.
Wow.
Right? The Metropolitan Water Reclamation District has their plant there. And also Mazola corn oil.
No way.
Yes.
What?
Yes. Like the classic, right?
Right.
And so you have all these origins, right? I think what happens is what emerges is the recognition that the U.S. in the mid and late 19th century becomes this formidable force for grain across the world. We still are, alongside maybe 3 or 4 other countries, including Ukraine. So important we are to, especially the corn and soy today, that so much is influenced by that. So in the beginning of the 20th century, you had the USDA marketing corn products that came out of Chicago across the world. And you begin to see recipe books in Europe with corn.
They didn't even have it until
Military rations in Europe with corn in them from the U.S.
From Chicago.
And at the Columbian Exposition in 1893, you have a corn palace.
What?
What's a corn palace?
It was a palace built to celebrate corn by the state of Iowa.
Wow, that's the most Midwestern thing I've ever heard.
By the state of Iowa.
Corn palace.
And you had a kitchen in there in the women's building with recipes and a book that was created to cook with corn. I think all of this is to say that corn became, and eventually soy later on, became such an essential piece of Chicago's economy. I mean, the Board of Trade was largely created in Chicago around the trade of commodities and futures in the corn sector. Eventually, pork bellies and other kinds of things that fed corn.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Livestock down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans because the Union forces had blockaded the port of New Orleans. So they fed them corn and sent them to Chicago, to the emerging stockyard. This is in the 1860s, right?
Yeah.
Really expanding the meatpacking industry in Chicago and the need for labor.
Right.
So there's other things going on in Europe at the time that led to another major labor force. By the way, the German immigration was also spurred by the railroad industry, and a lot of people came from Germany to construct the railroads.
Right.
But the population that really was drawn to Chicago or recruited to Chicago was from Poland, which makes the sort of the foundation of the origin of Chicago as, like, I think we're the second largest Polish city in the world, right? After Warsaw. So that population that comes to work in the meatpacking industry principally, alongside Irish and other groups, they formulate this labor force that essentially works for 3 big meatpacking companies. Armour, Swift, and Nelson. And those were the big 3 that formulated the sort of core of the meatpacking industry in Chicago and the Union stockyards. And getting back to the word union, though, for a second, the conditions of these stockyards, I mean, to the present, slaughterhouses are one of the worst industries that you can work in.
Yeah,
Right.
y'all can go back and listen to that episode. We know.
You've already gone that route.
Yeah.
Well, late 19th century, early 20th century, escalate that, 1,000 times.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And so those conditions and the wages that workers received were incredibly harsh. And it led to tensions and the beginnings of the union movement, industrial workers in Chicago, which I think one could say Chicago played a huge part in the development of unions in general because of the meatpacking industry.
Yeah, for sure.
But
Pullman. And
I mean, the sort of foundation of that in sort of labor history is the Haymarket Affair, the 1886
Right.
sort of violent uprising that led, to an explosion, a bomb exploding, and many people dying.
Right.
And there's a monument commemorating that today, and it's still sort of people debate on whether to call it a riot or something else, right? But essentially, it was about the 8-hour workday, and it was about pushing for that because so many people were working 12, 15, 16 hours in the meatpacking plants.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous.
And also, there were no child labor laws, and so there was lots of reasons that labor became a movement. The labor movement became so foundational to Chicago. And so one of the things that the owners did is they recruited African Americans from the South in the train car load up from Mississippi and other parts of the South, and sort of put them in the vulnerable position of if wanting to work, they would have to cross the picket line.
Yeah, what you gonna do? Yeah.
And immediately creating the racial tensions, early 20th century, like beginning at the very beginning of the century, that we still are working through today. Racial segregation was at play in what originally was called the Black Belt of Chicago, eventually Bronzeville and other references, but essentially that was built around Wentworth, which was the dividing line between sort of black communities and Irish and Polish and other groups.
Right.
And so you find that the meatpacking industry is intricately tied to issues of racial segregation and tension that are really nurtured by the industry itself,
Right. Yeah.
which poses people against one another
Yeah.
and creates even more of that othering nature that is at the foundation
Right.
of racism.
That's a very good
Right.
take and angle from this whole thing. You know, because you don't talk about food definitely brings people together, but it also kind of divided.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that's
Especially when people in power are orchestrating those divisions in order to be more profitable.
I was
Right,
gonna say
right.
benefit them, so they didn't care.
Capitalism, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So, by the turn of the century, by 1900, 80% of the country's meat is produced in Chicago, and a lot of it is starting to go to Europe even,
Right.
Right.
because they had in Chicago, I think it was Nelson, piloted the refrigerated rail cars. And so they started to not just send the actual live animals on the cars out east,
Send
Yeah.
but packed in
Yeah.
ice, which itself is built on the beer industry.
Oh.
Because the ice harvesting industry was started by the Germans who wanted lager beer. which had to be refrigerated. So there are all these lakes across, northern Illinois where ice harvesting, the ice house. Well, have you ever heard of the ice house?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the actual ice house was actually a industrial ice production, area that drew on fresh water from lakes scattered across northern Illinois to produce big blocks of ice that could be used to refrigerate lager beer. And then the idea was, what if we actually have ice houses all along, ice storage places all along the rail out east, and pack the meat in ice in Chicago on rail, and have it stop at various places for replenishing the ice.
Wow.
But all that's built on the fact that Germans wanted lager beer refrigerated.
Wow.
The rest of the Europeans were like, we'll take it warm,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, we don't care. Yeah.
But, so you have this really interesting sort of, and there's a whole controversy over beer and the German beer industry in Chicago that sort of tangents around drinking beer on Sundays and all kinds of stuff.
Right.
You know what's funny? As I was talking about like the ice houses and like being here in Chicago, the Coors is taste the Rockies and everything. Really, it's like taste the Chicago Great Lakes.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
What?
any lake, a little lake.
Any lake, yeah.
So, the other thing that you can't go, we really can't go without talking about when it comes to meat packing is salt. And Chicago was the salt distribution capital of.
What was Chicago not the capital
Yeah,
of?
I mean,
Is what I wanna
like
know.
you've named like
Right?
five things.
Like
that we
five
can-
main industries
Yeah.
that Chicago was the heart of. That's crazy.
Yeah, we weren't the capital of citrus.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, we leave that to Florida.
Coffee,
But I mean, salt, grains.
Well, the reason salt isn't, we have no salt naturally here.
Right.
We brought salt in from Michigan and New York. Syracuse is the salt city, right? I mean, and Michigan and by Detroit, there are all the salt mines there. But it was interesting because there was salt in Illinois. It was in Shawneetown or near Shawneetown. Essentially, there was a large demand for this meat in barrels for the Civil War.
Okay, yeah.
That's how they shipped it in barrels, right?
That's,
Wow.
that's
For
crazy.
canning, really.
Right.
Canning becomes really important later. But they needed salt. And so meatpacking actually is what created the salt industry in Chicago. And they had to bring it in by ships and train to Chicago from the east. And principally from Michigan and New York. And a couple other places, but and so some people have argued that salt was critical in actually the Union succeeding in the Civil War
Really?
because they were
Good
able
food,
to have this meatpacking industry in Chicago with all this salt that was brought in and get it to the military, the Union soldiers. And also there was blockades against salt for the Confederate soldiers that made it difficult for them to get
Right.
meat rations,
So they couldn't eat.
which were kind of critical at that
Right.
time.
Yeah.
Vegetarianism wasn't a
Yeah, that was-
really in the military. So in any count, a lot of this has to do with the Ohio River and the meat industry in the South, as that was also a dividing line, as you may know. But speeding ahead to, Joey Morton comes to Chicago, gets his feet wet in salt, working for a company, and eventually buys the company. Eventually, expands it with the help of the meatpacking industry, right, to this major salt industry, and eventually realizes that, hey, humans could eat salt also, in addition to the meat that they're eating.
Put those two together.
It's like flavor.
Flavor.
And so it comes up with the idea of individual salt shakers, right?
Wow.
And one of the most successful marketing campaigns in history was the young girl with the umbrella.
Yeah.
Where salt is literally raining.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that becomes sort of, foundational in creating the salt that we know today on our table, the table salt. Really, Chicago can be seen as one of them, if not the inventor of table salt.
Oh,
Wow.
God.
Because of Joy Morton. Now, Joy Morton, he was all over the place. He invested in the corn industry in Argo, and he invested in the sugar industry, which was from corn. I think today we kind of look at the remnants of that. Now the Morton Salt warehouse has become the Salt Shed.
Right, yeah.
And we forget that all of the foundations of that are really because Chicago was a food industry hub.
I mean, we say it all the time. Chicago is dope. For we're the birthplace, and that's why this podcast is what it is. You know what I mean? To learn the history of this kind of stuff. But every time we do something like this, we're always like, "What?" Like, you know what I mean?
Like we know how great it is, but then we're shocked.
Yeah, even more. And like some of these things we know from a crust layer, right?
Right.
Then we start to dive deep, and you really understand, why, how, I guess, not why, but like how it started and like how Chicago had a hand. So, I mean, this conversation has been bookmark this one. This is one that honestly I'm just like, holy cow, like.
Yeah.
So thank you. I mean,
You're welcome.
Yeah, honestly, where can we find that book? Where can we find that book?
Chicago Food Biography.
Okay.
Daniel Block and Howard Rosing. On Amazon, wherever.
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
Get that book.
Field.
We're just gonna have you back on here and just talk about this. Just go through the book with us.
And Daniel Block too. He's phenomenal, and I would
Bring him.
recommend bringing him in as well. He's probably the most well-versed person on food in Chicago.
Wow.
Well,
Episode
2, part 2 of this
part
one.
2 of this one.
Part 2.
Yeah.
That's a great lead on right there. We have to. Well, enough. Wrap. Cut. And there you have it. There's the full interview with Howard. So many dope facts in there. I mean, we honestly could have sat there, like we said in the audio part, for probably another 3 hours, right? Just listening to what he had to say. His knowledge is just amazing. Make sure you go check out his book, because I'm sure if he talked this kind of talk here, you can only imagine, what is in that book. And I can't wait to kind of dive into that. But again, thank you for watching this video. If you are watching, if you are listening, thank you again. We truly appreciate y'all. This is why we do the podcast, enlighten you and the rest of the world on why Chicago is dope. But without further ado, I'm out. No, I'm not going to end like that. That's kind of corny. Without further ado, without further ado, you hear that? Anyway, y'all be safe out here, man. Until next time, we'll catch you. Peace.
Hey, thank you so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed that. Please follow us on all social media at 77 Flavors Shy. And if you have any ideas and things you want to learn about, please email us at media@77flavorsshy.com.
Yeah, and if you could, also head on over to our YouTube channel, same thing, 77 Flavors Shy, and give us a follow, give us a like, and give us a good rating there. Make some comments.
Only
Go ahead and
if you
subscribe.
like it.
We love y'all. See you next week.